Today we will ask, what were the main benefits of slavery for the enslaved? And there were benefits. Were slaves safe from lynchings? And what were the main detriments of slavery for the enslaved? Why was it illegal to teach slaves how to read and write? Is chattel slavery, where the slave is the property of the owner, the only type of slavery? Are servants a type of slave? Were serfs a type of slave? Are minimum wage employees who are not earning a living wage a type of wage slave? We will summarize our thoughts on these questions from our many videos on American history and slavery. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in our PowerPoint script posted to SlideShare. In July 2023, the state of Florida has instructed teachers to teach children that slaves did gain some benefits before the Civil War. When asked, Governor Ron DeSantis suggested that some slaves did receive vocational training that benefited them, and he mentioned blacksmiths. So we can also ask, what vocational or educational opportunities were open for slaves to improve themselves? Slaves did indeed receive some benefits under slavery. For example, for them to work for their masters would have to feed them. Now, free food is indeed a benefit, although it will not matter much unless there are other benefits. So we will simply answer these questions. Now, to adequately answer these questions, we need to better understand what it means to be a slave and the various types of slaves. We know that there were numerous slaves in the Roman Empire, but as the empire collapsed, over the centuries, slaves became less common and were replaced by serfs. Serfs were allowed some freedoms. They were allowed to marry. They were technically not owned by anyone, but serfs farmed the land and were not allowed to leave the noble's banner in which they were born. Serfs were very poor. Could they be considered slaves? What about modern-day workers who earn only the minimum wage, who do not earn enough to feed their families with dignity, who are not paid a living wage? Should they be considered to be a wage slave? What is certain is that the practice of slavery varied by culture. What distinguished the system of slavery in the Deep South from the many forms of slavery in the ancient world? Slavery in the Deep South was racial slavery, and the blacks were seen as inferior to whites, divinely condemned to servitude. Now, these were the general categories of slaves in all slave societies, both ancient and modern. First of all, you had household servants and small farmhand slaves. This was often a milder form of slavery. Sometimes servants were treated as a member of the family. But in the Deep South, blacks could never truly be treated as part of the family, since blacks were considered to be an inferior race. Now, concubines, both consenting and unwilling, were often captured in war. And sexual abuse and rape of female slaves is a problem for all cultures with slaves. Raping black slaves was as rampant as it was profitable on southern plantations. Now, the least numerous are the independent city slaves who were tradesmen. Often they were allowed to retain some proceeds from their trade and buy their freedom. And this type of slave was far less common in the Deep South, and it was more common in ancient Greece and Rome. Now, the most numerous are the field hands for large plantations, and in the South they worked under the overseer's whip. Since the slave owner had minimal contact with these slaves, their lives could be quite harsh. And we have the worst type of slaves, the slaves who worked in mines. This was usually a death sentence. And we can see in the painting that women slaves are sold nude. This was true in most slave auctions, modern and ancient. After all, the buyer has the right to inspect the property which he is buying. Now, there was one very real benefit of slavery to the enslaved in the Deep South. Before the Civil War, slaves were far less likely to be lynched or killed than were freed slaves after the war. The reason for this was simple. It is illegal to damage someone else's property, and slaves were extremely valuable. Slaves were the most valuable asset class in America before the Civil War. Before the Civil War, a slave was worth as much as an economy car is worth today. The neighbors of a slave master couldn't kill his slave, but he and his overseers could. The runaway slave, Frederick Douglass, in his youth, witnessed an overseer killing an unruly slave. And it was common for a master to beat his slaves. Frederick Douglass witnessed many such beatings, often simply to satisfy the sadistic pleasure of a cruel overseer. After the Confederacy lost the Civil War, and especially after Reconstruction, lynchings of blacks became commonplace. Ida B. Wells was a brave black journalist who risked her life to report on many of the lynchings of her day. Through her efforts and those of W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of Crisis, the NAACP magazine, they documented over 6,000 lynchings through newspaper accounts. The actual figures were likely over 10,000. There were gruesome lynchings scheduled for Sunday afternoons, so the faithful could attend church services before. And it was rare for lynchers to be charged for murder in the Deep South, and even rarer for Southern juries to convict them. Was the average slave able to take advantage of vocational training so they could become blacksmiths or other occupations? After the Civil War, the freed slaves could attend black colleges, often tuition-free, such as the Hampton Institute and the Tuskegee Institute, and most black colleges offered vocational education as part of the curriculum. Before the Civil War, few black schools existed in the Deep South. Whatever training was at the whim of the plantation owner, and whipping rather than education is what was employed to increase production on most plantations. The vast majority of slaves were field slaves, and there was no reason to train them to do anything but pick cotton or some other crop. After the war, most vocational training for blacks centered on agriculture and the building trades, which likely included blacksmiths. Rarely were slaves taught how to read and write. Why? Well, if a slave were literate, he could then read the abolitionist literature and start plotting his escape to the North. In fact, as a consequence of the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion of 1831, it was illegal to teach a slave how to read and write. Nat Turner was both literate and a preacher, and inspired by a solar eclipse he'd interpreted as a divine sign, he led an armed rebellion that murdered over 60 whites. What were the political consequences of Nat Turner's slave rebellion? More state legislatures prohibited teaching slaves and freed blacks how to read. Black schools in the South and the North were destroyed by mobs. There was prejudice against blacks in both the South and the North, and there were freed blacks in both the South and the North, but an overwhelming majority of the black slaves labored in the plantations and homesteads of the Deep South, which meant that prejudice was always more intense in the South. And we discussed this in our video on 3 generations of leading black leaders. What were the major detriments of slavery? Many slaves in the Deep South desperately sought to run away. Many risked their lives and the lives of their children to escape through the informal Underground Railroad, smuggling them to freedom in the North. Often they had to flee all the way to Canada to escape the slave catchers who pursued them. Why were slaves so eager to escape? Aside from constant whippings and abuse, often slave families were broken apart on the auction block. In the seaboard states like Virginia, it was more profitable to breed slaves for plantations in the Black Belt southern states, like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, than it was to grow crops. Often children were torn away from their families and sold individually. And to illustrate the benefits and detriments, let's look at some examples from various slave narratives. There were regional differences in the institution of slavery, which were revealed when we review the best-known slave narratives of Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery in the 1830s abolitionist era, and Booker T. Washington and Augustine Tolton, who were emancipated at the end of the Civil War. Frederick Douglass was born a slave in Maryland. He was separated from his mother as an infant, and his mother's owner lived a dozen miles away, and he only saw her 4 or 5 times, and only at night. His mother was likely raped by a white slave owner. He did not know who his father was. He remembers how slaves were often savagely whipped and sexually abused. White masters could do as they wished with their property. Slaves were given no bed. They slept side by side on the cold, damp floor, covered by miserable blankets. Sometimes black children were fed at troughs like hogs. Frederick Douglass remembers. At the farms he worked on when he was young, men and women slaves received as their monthly ration 8 pounds of pork, or its equivalent in fish, and 1 bushel of cornmeal. Their yearly clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts, 1 pair of linen trousers, 1 jacket, 1 pair of winter trousers made of coarse Negro cloth, 1 pair of stockings, and 1 pair of shoes. The children, unable to work, had neither shoes, stockings, jackets, or trousers. Their clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts per year. When these wore out, they went naked until next allowance day, even in the winter. Like Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington was born a field slave in Southwest Virginia. The family lived in a 1-room cabin, everyone sleeping on the floor. He never knew who his father was. He suspected he was one of the white masters. Unending toil, dawn to dusk, was their life, the life of a slave, until his family was emancipated at the end of the Civil War. Booker T. Washington was an illiterate slave, and after emancipation he learned how to read and attended the Hampton Institute. He impressed the headmaster, who recommended him to be the first headmaster of the Tuskegee Institute. He was a leading black leader of his era, He raised funds from northern business tycoons to fund the impressive expansion of Tuskegee Institute. Augustine Tolton was born an illiterate field slave in Kentucky. Slaves of Catholic owners sometimes had more dignity. Their marriages were recognized by the church and their births were recorded in the parish registry. However, they were still slaves. His biography records how some families were broken up when the master's estate was settled, although parents and their children were kept together. After the Civil War, Augustine Tolton overcame daunting obstacles to attend seminary in Rome and be ordained as the first ex-slave black Catholic priest in America, becoming literate in 4 languages: English, German, Latin, and Koine Greek, shepherding a parish first in his adopted city, Quincy, Illinois, then in Chicago. Slavery did not end with the Civil War. The Reconstruction Amendment abolishing slavery includes a loophole for convict labor. The Deep South took advantage of this, enslaving blacks picked up for vagrancy and bogus infractions, farming them out as slave labor to plantations, mines, and other businesses. Many blacks died under concentration labor camp conditions. Peonage was not substantially abolished until World War II under FDR's administration. We also reflected on how the Jewish Old Testament and rabbis, the Stoic philosophers, and Christian church fathers over the centuries sought to alleviate the working conditions and improve the dignity of slaves and servants. Southerners in the secession conventions where the Confederate States seceded from the Union proudly proclaimed that they would be fighting the Civil War specifically to protect the institution of slavery, and that the black race was inferior to the white race. And what were some of the sources we used for this video? And the slave narratives we reviewed are highly readable and are interesting because they provide a glimpse into the daily lives of those who lived in a very different time. The third generation black leader, W.E.B. Du Bois, was born in Massachusetts during Reconstruction and was one of the first blacks to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard. His history, Black Reconstruction, although it was sidelined and mostly ignored when it was written, eventually changed the narrative on Reconstruction during the Civil Rights era of the 60s. He quotes from the Congressional Record many brutalities black freed slaves suffered during Reconstruction. His essay, Soul of Black Folk, includes an essay on sharecropping, the plantation labor system that replaced slavery that, like serfdom, protected the black family, although it left blacks destitute and bound to the land by mountains of debt. Yale University has posted their 2 undergraduate classes on black history on YouTube. They were influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. We've summarized these 24 lectures in 5 shorter videos. And the book Bloody Shirt contains individual stories of how difficult it was for Northern troops to protect the civil rights and lives of freed slaves in the defeated Southern states. There are direct and indirect correlations between the segregationist Jim Crow legislation and the persecution of the Jews under the German Nazi regime. W.E.B. Du Bois, co-founder of the NAACP, was the leading black leader in the era following Booker T. Washington. His life spanned the years from Reconstruction during the 2 world wars and ending at the start of the Civil Rights era of the 60s. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.